Eilean Donan Castle stands where three great sea lochs, Loch Duich, Loch Long, and Loch Alsh, flow into one another, creating a constantly shifting landscape of tides, mist, and light. The castle's position is not poetic by accident, it is strategic to its core. From this narrow point of convergence, any movement between the inner Hebrides and the mainland could be observed, controlled, or challenged. Water was both barrier and highway here, and the castle's silhouette rises directly from that logic, anchored to a tidal island that appears and disappears with the rhythm of the sea. The surrounding waters define how the castle is experienced. At low tide, stone causeways connect the island to the shore, exposing mud flats and glistening rock. At high tide, the castle seems to float, cut off from the land and wrapped by moving water on all sides. This constant transformation shaped how the fortress functioned historically, turning timing into defense. Approaching forces had to calculate not only distance, but tide, wind, and weather, all of which could change within hours in the Western Highlands. The meeting of the three sea lochs also made the castle a political threshold. This was a border zone between regions, clans, and spheres of influence, especially during the turbulent centuries when Norse, Gaelic, and later Scottish royal interests collided. Control of this point meant influence over trade routes, military passage, and communication lines, linking the western seaboard to the interior. The castle did not merely guard land, it guarded movement itself. Architecture here responds directly to water and rock. The thick walls, compact layout, and limited approach routes reflect the need to withstand both attack and isolation. Supplies, reinforcements, and messengers often arrived by boat, making the lochs as important as roads. From the battlements, the horizon is fractured by channels and headlands, forcing the eye to scan constantly, never resting on a single line of approach. Surveillance was not passive. It was a continuous act of interpretation. The surrounding landscape amplifies the castle's presence. Mountains rise sharply behind the lochs, their slopes funneling weather and shadow toward the water. Clouds move low and fast, altering visibility in moments. In such conditions, the castle becomes both landmark and warning signal, its stone mass visible from afar, yet often half concealed by mist. This ambiguity, seen but not fully known, added to its deterrent power. Cultural meaning gathered here as densely as the waters themselves. The castle became a symbol for clans tied to the Western Highlands, a place where loyalty, defense, and identity converged. Its location allowed it to watch over routes used not only by armies, but by fishermen, traders, and travelers whose lives depended on the same unpredictable seas. Everyday movement and high politics overlapped in the same narrow channels. Even in periods of destruction and abandonment, the site never lost its pull. The island's position ensured that memory lingered, reinforced by the visual drama of stone against water and sky. Each rebuilding phase echoed the same fundamental truth. This was a place chosen by geography, long before it was shaped by human hands. The meeting of three seas dictated the castle's purpose, rhythm, and enduring power, making Eilean Donan not just a fortress, but a node where landscape and history continuously collide. Eilean Donan Castle functioned as a guardian not through sheer size, but through position and awareness. Placed at the western gateway to the Highlands, it watched over routes that connected the sea lanes of the Atlantic world to the inland glens. Any force moving from the coast toward the heart of Scotland had to pass through narrow corridors of water and land, all visible from the castle's walls. Defence here was about anticipation rather than reaction, about seeing movement long before it became threat. The surrounding geography turned the castle into a natural checkpoint. Mountains, lochs, and winding valleys funneled travel into predictable paths, limiting where ships could land and where armies could march. From this vantage point, defenders could observe sails on the horizon or riders along distant shorelines. The Highlands were vast and difficult to control, but this single point allowed oversight of an entire region's access routes, making it disproportionately powerful. Control of the castle meant control over communication. Messengers travelling between clans, royal authorities, and coastal allies relied on these same routes. The fortress acted as an information hub, filtering news from the western seas before it reached inland strongholds. In times of conflict, this flow of information could determine whether clans mobilized in time or were caught unprepared. Intelligence, not walls alone, defined its strategic value. The castle's defensive role was also psychological. Its presence signalled authority in a landscape where power was often contested. To approaching ships or travellers, the stone walls rising from the loch announced that this territory was watched and defended. Even without active conflict, the knowledge that the castle could signal, block passage, or call for reinforcements discouraged intrusion. Deterrence here worked quietly, reinforced by reputation as much as force. During periods of clan rivalry, the castle became a fulcrum in shifting alliances. Holding it allowed certain clans to project influence far beyond their immediate lands, shaping regional balance without constant warfare. Its loss or capture could quickly destabilize surrounding territories, exposing inland settlements to raids or political pressure. The Highlands' fragmented power structure made such nodes of control especially critical. Supply and movement were inseparable from defence. Boats delivered food, weapons, and people through the lochs, while the castle ensured these channels remained secure. In hostile times, controlling the waterways meant denying enemies the ability to sustain prolonged campaigns. The Highlands' harsh terrain amplified this effect. Cutting off access often mattered more than defeating an enemy in open battle. Even as military technology evolved and the nature of warfare changed, the logic of the site remained clear. The castle's role as guardian was rooted in geography that could not be bypassed. Stone walls could crumble and be rebuilt. Clans could rise and fall. But the narrow passages between sea and mountain endured. Eilean Donan's strategic importance lay in this permanence, standing watch over the Highlands not as an isolated monument, but as an active participant in the region's long, defensive story. In the Highlands, a castle was never just stone and timber. It was a visible claim to land, loyalty, and obedience. Eilean Donan's power as a clan stronghold came from how it translated local authority into something the whole region could see. The lochs around it acted like roads, and the castle sat directly on those roads, deciding who passed, who paid, who was welcomed, and who was warned off. For a clan leader, holding a place like this meant turning family influence into regional control. Clan strength depended on networks, kinship ties, fosterage bonds, marriage alliances, and sworn followings that could shift quickly in hard times. The castle worked like a knot tying those networks together. It was a site where agreements were negotiated, where hostages could be held to guarantee promises, where disputes could be settled under the threat of force. Local authority needed a stage, and a fortress on a tidal island gave that authority a dramatic, undeniable setting. Inside a clan stronghold, power was practiced daily, not only during war, stores of grain and salted fish, barrels of ale, weapons kept ready, boats maintained for quick movement. These were the practical foundations of rule. A chief's household was not simply domestic, it was administrative. Decisions about grazing rights, fishing access, tribute, and protection were inseparable from the castle's ability to enforce them. People living in nearby settlements understood that the castle was where outcomes were decided. The castle also embodied the clan's ability to protect, and protection was the currency that bought loyalty. In a landscape where raiding was a constant possibility, safety was not abstract. A stronghold offered refuge, a rallying point, and a place to regroup after losses. Even those who resented a chief's demands could recognize the value of a fortified centre when storms, hunger, or enemies arrived. Authority in the Highlands was often justified through survival. Rival clans understood the same logic, which is why strongholds became targets, as much as battlefields. Capturing a castle did more than remove defenders. It disrupted the social order around it. Tribute stopped flowing, allies hesitated, and smaller families recalculated their loyalties. A single change of control could reshape local politics overnight, not through speeches or laws, but through the simple fact of who now held the keys, the stores, and the vantage point. Eilean Donan's setting intensified the clan dimension because it linked inland and seaward worlds. Clans were not isolated hill communities. Many depended on maritime routes for trade, movement, and contact with distant allies. The castle's position at the meeting of sea lochs let a clan project power outward, influencing coastal traffic and maintaining connections across water. Control here meant the ability to respond quickly, sending men by boat, receiving reinforcements, or cutting off rivals from crucial access points. Ritual and symbolism mattered too. Clan authority was reinforced through gatherings, feasting, and formal displays of unity that turned private loyalty into public spectacle. A stronghold provided the space and the atmosphere for that performance. The hall where stories were repeated, where oaths were witnessed, where a chief's generosity or severity became legend. These moments were not decorative. They were political technology, shaping how people remembered power and how they explained their place within it. Local authority in the Highlands rarely felt stable, which made a stronghold's endurance even more important. Even when the castle faced destruction or periods of abandonment, the idea of it as a clan seat could outlive the buildings themselves. Memory clung to the site because it represented a time when local rule was tangible, when power had a doorway, a wall, a watchtower facing the loch. The castle's history as a clan stronghold is not just about who owned it, but about how Highland society itself was organised. Personal, territorial, and always one calculation away from shifting. In the Western Highlands, the sea was never just scenery, it was the fastest road into danger. Long before Scotland was a single, tightly governed kingdom, coastal communities learned to read the water like a warning system. A sail on the horizon could mean trade, or it could mean raiders moving with terrifying speed, able to strike a shoreline settlement and vanish again before any inland response could form. In that world, a stronghold positioned at a choke point between sea lochs mattered because it forced the maritime world to slow down, to narrow, to become visible. Viking pressure in the region did not always look like one dramatic invasion. It often arrived as a pattern: seasonal attacks, opportunistic raids, and shifting control over islands and coastal routes. The Norse presence also brought settlement, alliances and hybrid cultures along the seaways, which made the threat harder to define. A fortress guarding the meeting of lochs would have to assume that danger might arrive as a fleet, a single longship, or even as friends whose loyalties were flexible. Defence became an everyday posture. Watch, question, delay, and prepare for betrayal as much as for open assault. Water geography shaped every response. Narrow channels and tidal constraints meant attackers could be forced into predictable approaches, while defenders could time their movements around tides and visibility. A castle in this landscape was not simply waiting behind walls. It was controlling the rhythm of the coastline, deciding when boats could pass, where they could land, and how quickly news could travel inland. The lochs acted like funnels, and anyone who held the funnel held the tempo of the conflict. As centuries passed and Norse influence ebbed and flowed, the nature of threat shifted from raiders to rival powers competing for legitimacy and territory. Western Scotland became a zone where royal claims, regional lordships, and clan interests overlapped, sometimes cooperating, often colliding. Warfare here was rarely front lines in the modern sense. It was disruption, raids on cattle, burning of crops, seizure of key crossings, and sudden strikes designed to force a political decision. Strongholds mattered because they could endure disruption long enough to outlast it. When Scotland's internal struggles intensified, the same coastal gateways that once feared Norse fleets now became vital in Scottish conflicts. Control of a strategic fortress meant control over movement of men, weapons, and supplies between mainland and islands, between sea allies and inland forces. A castle could be used to project authority outward, pressuring neighbouring territories, guarding clan lands, and controlling the flow of tribute or tolls. In a fragmented political landscape, holding the right stone anchor point could matter more than winning a single battle. Local conflicts were also shaped by reputation and memory. A stronghold associated with successful resistance, whether against raiders, rivals, or royal enemies, could become a symbol that attracted followers and intimidated challengers. That symbolic power had practical effects. Allies were more likely to commit. Neutral families were more likely to lean your way. And enemies had to plan not only for walls and weapons, but for the morale the place represented. In Highland warfare, psychology and logistics were often inseparable. Even when formal wars are discussed, the texture on the ground was often personal. Sworn bonds, feuds, retaliations, broken agreements, and sudden reversals. A fortress functioned like a stabilizer in that volatility, an archive of power where hostages could be held, negotiations staged, and oaths enforced under the shadow of force. It could also become the flashpoint that triggered violence, because taking it was not merely strategic. It was a public announcement that the local order had changed hands. By the time Scotland's conflicts became entangled with wider British and European power struggles, the Western Highlands still kept their older logic. Whoever controlled the gateways controlled the options. Outside armies and governments might have larger ambitions, but they still had to move through narrow routes, rely on local intelligence, and confront a landscape that punished slow decision-making. In that sense, the story from Viking threats to Scottish wars is less a clean transition than a continuous adaptation. New flags, new claims, the same hard geography forcing conflict into the same narrow places. After its violent destruction, the castle did not vanish from the landscape, but it withdrew from use. Stone walls collapsed inward, roofs disappeared, and interiors filled with wind, rain, and drifting vegetation. What remained was not an empty site, but a paused one, suspended between function and oblivion. The lochs continued to rise and fall around it, tides washing past broken masonry, as if the structure were being slowly erased and rewritten by nature rather than human hands. For generations, the ruin stood without garrison, without household noise, without banners. This silence was not brief. It stretched across centuries, long enough for living memory to fade into story. Locals passed it as part of the scenery, a familiar presence stripped of authority. The castle no longer controlled movement or power, yet it retained visibility, anchoring the landscape with a reminder that something important had once stood watch here. Absence itself became meaningful. With no active role, the ruin invited interpretation rather than obedience. Travellers, poets, and later artists encountered it not as a military structure but as an emotional object. Broken walls framed the sky, doorways opened onto water instead of halls, and collapsed towers suggested both violence and endurance. The ruin allowed viewers to imagine loss without witnessing it, turning destruction into atmosphere. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this silent presence aligned perfectly with romantic sensibilities. Ruins were no longer seen as failures of defense or symbols of decline, but as gateways into the past. The castle's isolation, its reflection in still water, and its dramatic setting among mountains and mist transformed it into a visual shorthand for a lost Highland world. The lack of activity made it easier to project meaning onto it. Nostalgia, tragedy, resistance, and continuity all at once. National memory began to settle into the stones. The ruin was absorbed into broader narratives of Scottish identity, especially those emphasising endurance after defeat and dignity after loss. It no longer represented a specific clan or conflict. Instead, it stood for an idea of Scotland shaped by hardship, landscape, and historical rupture. The silence around it made the site feel timeless, as if it belonged equally to every century that passed it. The aesthetic power of the ruin came from incompleteness. Unlike restored monuments that guide interpretation, the broken castle invited imagination. Viewers supplied their own histories, filling gaps with emotion rather than fact. This openness made it especially potent in art, literature, and later, photography, where the ruin functioned as a stage for memory rather than a document of events. When restoration eventually arrived, it was shaped by this long silence. The rebuilding did not erase the romantic image. It responded to it. The restored form echoed what people believed the castle should have been, not necessarily what it once was in every detail. In that sense, the centuries of abandonment had already rebuilt the castle in the national imagination before any stone was lifted. The long gap between destruction and revival gave the site a dual identity. It existed simultaneously as a historical structure and as a symbol formed by absence. The years of silence did not weaken its meaning. They deepened it, allowing the castle to shift from local stronghold to shared memory. What survived was not continuous occupation, but a powerful idea shaped by ruin, landscape, and time. The 20th century rebirth of Eilean Donan Castle did not begin as a simple act of reconstruction, but as a decision about meaning. After centuries of ruin, the question was not whether the castle could be rebuilt, but what version of the past should return. The island had become inseparable from its broken silhouette, yet the desire to restore it reflected a broader modern impulse. To reclaim history not as fragments, but as lived space. The rebuilding effort unfolded slowly, guided as much by imagination and landscape as by surviving evidence. Reconstruction required an intimate negotiation with stone. Much of the original masonry had collapsed into the lost or been scattered across the island, forcing builders to read the ground itself as a historical archive. Reused stones carried scars of earlier violence and weathering, while newly cut blocks had to be shaped to blend rather than dominate. The goal was not pristine uniformity, but continuity, an architecture that acknowledged interruption without freezing the castle in ruin. Water shaped every stage of the rebirth. The castle's tidal setting limited access, dictated working hours, and constantly reminded builders that the site could never be separated from its environment. Materials arrived by boat, just as they had centuries earlier, reinforcing a rhythm older than modern construction methods. The surrounding lochs reflected the rising walls, making the act of rebuilding a visual dialogue between stone and moving water. Landscape was treated not as a backdrop, but as a structural partner. Sight lines toward mountains and channels were preserved, ensuring that the restored castle did not overpower its setting. Roof lines, wall heights, and massing were chosen to echo the island's natural proportions. Rather than imposing dominance, the rebuilt structure appears anchored, its weight distributed visually across rock, tide, and sky. Modern restoration also had to balance authenticity with usability. The castle was rebuilt to be entered, crossed, and inhabited by visitors, not simply admired from afar. Yet this accessibility was carefully staged. Narrow passages, confined rooms, and controlled viewpoints maintain the sense of defensibility and isolation that defined the original stronghold. Movement through the space reinforces its historical logic without requiring modern explanation. The 20th century vision behind the project was deeply shaped by national identity. Rebuilding the castle was an act of cultural recovery, transforming a romantic ruin into a tangible symbol of continuity. However, the restoration did not erase the memory of silence and destruction. Instead, it absorbed them. The finished structure feels aware of its interruption, as if rebuilt stone by stone with the knowledge that permanence is never guaranteed. The castle's renewed presence altered how it interacted with its environment. Light now catches on intact walls, water reflects a complete form, and the island reads again as a place of purpose rather than abandonment. Yet the harmony between architecture and nature remains fragile. Weather continues to mark the stone. Tides still isolate the island, and mist still obscures outlines, preserving the sense that the castle belongs to the Highlands more than the Highlands belong to it. What emerged from the 20th century rebirth is not a replica of a medieval fortress, but a carefully negotiated form of memory. Stone, water, and landscape operate together, each limiting and shaping the other. The rebuilt castle does not dominate its setting, it submits to it, repeating an old truth in modern form. Survival here depends not on conquering nature, but on understanding it. Eilean Donan has moved far beyond its original military and clan functions to become one of the most recognisable visual statements of Scotland itself. Its image circulates independently of its history, reproduced on postcards, book covers, advertisements, and digital screens. For many viewers, the castle appears first as an idea: mist, water, stone, and isolation compressed into a single frame, before it is understood as a specific place with layered historical meanings. This visual power works because the castle condenses multiple versions of Scottish identity into one form. It suggests endurance without explicit triumph, beauty shaped by hardship, and continuity achieved through adaptation. The surrounding landscape reinforces these associations. Mountains imply resilience, water implies separation and protection, and the narrow causeway implies selective access. The castle does not announce conquest. It implies survival, which resonates strongly within national memory. Modern tourism has turned this symbolic force into daily experience. Visitors approach the castle along the causeway, repeating a movement that once required calculation and permission. Cameras replace weapons, but the choreography remains deliberate. Each step narrows the world behind and focuses attention forward, framing the castle as both destination and threshold. Tourism here is not passive consumption, it reenacts historical approach and arrival. Cinema has amplified this effect by using the castle as visual shorthand. Filmmakers are drawn to its clarity of form and dramatic isolation, which allow it to stand in for ideas larger than its actual size. On screen, Eilean Donan rarely needs explanation. Its presence instantly signals antiquity, mystery, and authority rooted in landscape rather than empire. Film transforms the castle into a global ambassador for a particular image of Scotland. Romantic, restrained, and quietly powerful. At the same time, the site remains a functioning heritage space, rather than a static set. Maintenance, conservation, and interpretation continue to shape how the castle lives in the present. Staff, guides, and caretakers perform an invisible labour that keeps the structure active, balancing preservation with access. The castle's survival now depends less on defence and more on careful management, ensuring that symbolic power does not erode the physical fabric. Local identity still intersects with this global image. For surrounding communities, the castle is not only an icon but a neighbour, a workplace, and a familiar silhouette. Its role in regional economy through tourism ties contemporary livelihoods to historical imagery. This creates a layered relationship. Pride in international recognition coexists with an awareness that the castle's image often circulates far removed from everyday Highland life. The castle's status as a living symbol is reinforced through events, seasonal rhythms, and constant visitation. Weather, light, and tide continue to reshape how it is perceived, preventing it from becoming visually fixed. Each encounter is slightly different, preserving a sense of immediacy despite heavy representation. The castle remains photogenic not because it is frozen in time, but because it is perpetually changing. What defines Eilean Donan today is its ability to operate on multiple levels at once. It is a historical reconstruction, a national emblem, a tourist destination, and a cinematic image, all layered onto the same stones. These roles do not cancel each other out. They interact, sometimes uneasily, but productively. The castle's power lies in this tension, where identity is not declared once and for all, but continuously renegotiated between past and present.